to introduce our speaker. You've seen his bio already, but Dr. Mark Pisani is a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico. And I have to say, back in my day as a UNM undergraduate, we used to call it government, but I think it's now political science. At any rate, he has been a member of the faculty since 1992, and he has been the chair of the Department of Political Science from 2005 to 2011, and he also served a long tenure as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of New Mexico for some 10 years between 2011 and 2021. He was also, I should also say, the fact that he was once the president, we used to call it the chair of our organization, which at that point was the Albuquerque Committee on Foreign Relations, and he was the head at that point, called the chair, from 2008 to 2009. So Mark, without further hesitation, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much, Will. Thank you all for coming. And I just want to apologize in advance. I can't talk within the established amount of time, so if I keep you a little late, I apologize. Every student in my class knows I go over 3 minutes at least, every single class. So perhaps you can bring out extra desserts if it goes too long. So given that we are here on 9/11, I thought that I would start with an extended quote from the Bush administration's National Security Strategy document from 2002. Today, the United States enjoys a position of unparalleled military strength and great economic and political influence. In keeping with our heritage and principles, we do not use our strength to press for unilateral advantage. We seek instead to create a balance of power that favors human freedom. Conditions in which all nations and all societies can choose for themselves the rewards and challenges of political and economic liberty. In a world that is safe, people will be able to make their own lives better. We will defend the peace by fighting terrorists and tyrants. We will preserve the peace by building good relations among the great powers. We will extend the peace by encouraging free and open societies on every continent. That particular national security document is most famous for making a case for fighting terrorists and tyrants through preventative war, and sort of laid out the logic for why it made sense to go to war in Iraq. But this promotion of democracy was also a central theme throughout the document. And that was not unique. It's a recurring theme in US foreign policy going back more than a century, going back to the Spanish-American War. And especially recurring from World War II and beyond, and then in a particular way with the end of the Cold War. So during the Cold War, building a world filled with democracies was mostly building a world of Western states, allied states, into a coalition against the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's allies. And then the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and a number of administrations, Republican and Democrat, said, well, why don't we take this liberal world order for a ride and turn it into a global liberal world order? And so if you go through every administration, except for maybe one, two now, I guess, with the end of the Cold War, every single administration would have had an emphasis on themes similar to that paragraph from the Bush administration document in 2002. So with George Herbert Walker Bush, it was, a new world order. And part of that new world order was to support democracy, especially in Eastern Europe and globally. And then the Clinton administration came in with its doctrine of engagement and enlargement, where they wanted to enlarge the community of market democracies throughout the world. And that was a focal point for their strategy. And then George W. Bush created a balance of power that favors human freedom. I'm not entirely sure why they needed the human qualifier. I guess no freedom for insects or something, but a balance of power that favors freedom. The Obama administration did not really change the rhetoric, even if they were much more cautious and restrained. They weren't willing to do many of the things that their predecessors were willing to do to try and spread that vision, but they proclaimed a commitment to the same kind of vision. We'll chat about Trump in a moment. When Biden came in, his theme was, "We're back." You remember all that stuff that the United States used to do? We're going to do all that stuff again. It's going to be democracy, it's going to be free trade, it's going to be, we believe in international institutions, and he says that 4 years of my predecessor was an aberration. Now, forgive me for a moment, but I'm going to delve into abstract political science, international relations theory for maybe 5 minutes, and then I promise I'm done with that. The two major theories of international politics that have been competing with each other for a long time are realism and liberalism. And by the way, one of the principal leaders of the realist theory of international politics will be coming to speak to this group in the spring. So when John Mearsheimer's here, please come to see him. It'll be a great talk. And thank you, Greg, for making that possible to bring him here. Realism is a theory that says that the world is anarchic. There is no world government. States are the most important actors in that international system, and they have to look out for their security as job one, because it's a dangerous world out there, and if you don't make security your principal goal, then you could be conquered. You could cease to exist, or at least you could be, a loser in the international balance of power. And in order to sustain your security, one of the best ways to do that is to maximize your power, to make sure you have the capability to protect yourself. And in this realist theory, war is a natural part of world politics. And we shouldn't actually, think anything other than conflict is inevitable. Exactly where it's going to happen, this is not a theory that tells you precisely when wars will happen and what are the specific triggers. It just says that because of the nature of international politics, you can't get away from that kind of consequence. Now, the biggest moving part in most realist theories is they ask the question of how many great powers are there? And if you're a realist, you say the worst of all possible worlds is probably one that they call multipolarity. 3 or more great powers. Because if you have 3 or more great powers, you have to rely on allies to protect your security, and you never want to rely on another state to protect your security because you never know if they're going to actually be there when you need them. And there's much more uncertainty about who may join with whom to try and take advantage of, one great power. And the more opportunities that states have to think that they can succeed in war, the more likely it is you will have war. So 3 or 4 or 5 great powers of roughly equal stature is a dangerous world. And the realists look back at the Cold War and they said, it was such a wonderful, idyllic time. The best of all worlds is if you have only 2 great powers. Because then you're certain about who the enemy is. You hate each other's guts, but you're unlikely to go to war directly with the other one because you know how it's going to turn out. So there's increased certainty. And that gives you, it doesn't make anyone, happy, doesn't bring cooperation, but it brings more stability to the international system. And realists are also big fans of nuclear deterrence because they say that states are generally rational and they don't want to start a war that will lead to their death. And if there are two states that have assured second strike capability, you don't want to start a war with that state because it could lead to the destruction of your own state. So nuclear weapons lead to peace. The Cold War with only two great powers was a wonderful peace. They call it the long peace, the Cold War. So one of the problems with the realist theory is that it is a theory of constraints. And it says states do what they do because they are constrained by their position in the global balance of power. If you only have one great power that is clearly more powerful than anyone else, then the realists have trouble figuring out what happens next. Because that means there's one state in the system that is uniquely unconstrained by the global balance of power. So, in 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And the bipolar balance of power was replaced by unipolarity, or another word that is used for that, hegemony. And the United States was number one, and it could do whatever it damn well pleased. And if you want to understand what the United States damn well pleased, part of it is very consistent with a realist approach, which is realism says states pursue their national interests, security and power. And if you have one state with overwhelming power, they're going to like to run the world. That is a likely outcome of a unipolar or hegemonic balance of power. But another part of it is because this state is unconstrained, they can choose exactly how they want to try and run the world based on, national culture, their own historical perspective. And for the United States, this is where you bring in the other grand theory of international relations, liberalism. The United States is founded on liberal principles. Democracy, free enterprise, civil liberties. Yes, we haven't always actually lived up to those, but the national myth and the national culture says America is a liberal state. It's a democracy, free enterprise, limited government, respect for individual self-determination, respect for the rule of law. Again, not always honored, but it's a part of what we would tell ourselves is what makes Americans and America special. So the United States is the most powerful state in the world, not that long ago. And you ask the question, well, what is the United States going to try to do? And the answer was it was going to try to take the systems that were developed during the Cold War to unite, especially the Western Europeans, the Japanese, the Aussies, those from the 51st state. Oh, wait. It's still not the 51st state, is it? We're working on that. The Canadians and a variety of other folks, a whole architecture was developed, a trade regime to support free trade amongst those states, which later became fully globalized through the World Trade Organization. A global financial system based on the US dollar. An alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which gave every member of this alliance veto power over the collective actions of NATO. If the Greeks say we can't let Macedonia in because Macedonia is part of Greece, because Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, then Greece can actually hold up the inclusion of another member until that country changes its name. I think they're North Macedonia now. I'm not sure entirely. North Macedonia, good. And so with the end of the Cold War, the United States could say, let's try and take this set of relationships that we've developed amongst the other liberal states in the international system that were part of the Cold War coalition against the Soviet Union, let's take it globally. And the grand strategy that virtually every US administration has pursued since then has been a strategy of liberal hegemony. We run the world, and we run it kind of as a liberal system. And one aspect of that liberal hegemony was everyone should have the right and the freedom to be democracies just like us. And if you look at liberal international theory, there is a well-developed theory of international relations that says liberal states can form a peaceful union amongst themselves. If all of these states buy into liberal values, then part of that is respecting the self-determination of others. Anyone who has the same cultural values, we should let them live their lives, and we shouldn't mess with them. If you have trading relationships, this leads to mutually beneficial connections that you don't want to mess up by going to war. So part of the argument is idealistic, part of the argument is greed is good. Trade will lead to peace because you don't want to give up the benefits of trade, and war is expensive. It destroys a lot of economic activity. So states that trade together are unlikely to go to war with one another. The liberal world order depends on the creation of international law and international institutions that help these countries pursue goals that they have in common but have a difficult time achieving on their own. So if there are certain things that you need a collective action to try to achieve, let's create an international institution and have everyone join, and that's the place where you sort of figure out how to accomplish these collective goods. And then the last part of it was democracy is in part a set of political institutions that make it more difficult for countries to go to war. Immanuel Kant, several hundred years ago, said, and I'm paraphrasing now, said, if the people who pay the cost of war in lives and in treasure and in a debt that will never be repaid have a say in whether or not to go to war, they'll say, no, thank you. Whereas if a prince decides to go to war, he can do it because it won't affect his banquets and his hunts, and he does not pay the cost of that war. So democracies are less likely to go to war because they are institutionally constrained. There's another part of it that says that that doesn't necessarily mean they never go to war. It's just that they're much better at cherry picking their wars, because if people say this is an easy war where you can win, and we won't have to pay much in higher taxes, and we won't have to deal with a draft or anything like that, that's cool. Go do that. Maybe that'll bring some benefits. So democracies might be more constrained, or they might be more careful in choosing easy targets. But democracies also, many of them, are more powerful and more able to leverage the resources of their societies, because if they're uniting people in defense of the nation, they're able to extract a lot of more resources and a lot more commitment. And so democracies are difficult targets. So basically, democracies may go to war, but they go to war against weak autocratic states rather than other democracies. And part of that is sort of a rational action model, and part of it is, but it's not right to do it anyway. So real scientists, and I'm a terrible scientist, but real scientists have created these elaborate data sets where they measure democracy in a variety of different ways. They measure trade interdependence in a variety of ways. They measure joint membership in international organizations. And they put this all in a data set, usually dyad year data sets. So say you're Botswana.
Excuse me?
Say you're Botswana.
Okay.
No, you have to say you're Botswana. Say you are Bolivia.
Bolivia. I'm Bolivia.
So Bolivia, Botswana, 1945 is an observation. Bolivia, Botswana, 1946 is an observation. Bolivia, it's every country on the planet matched up with every other country for every year for which we can find all the data we want. And then you measure their trade relationships, you measure their regime type, you measure their membership, joint membership in international organizations. And the people who study this say, we have statistically proven that there is a liberal peace. Especially the ones that trade together, are part of the same organizations that have shared democracy. Those folks rarely fight each other. And so you've probably heard, in other documents, the Bush administration say, democracies don't fight each other. And that's why we want to build democracies around the world, to make the world a more peaceful place. Bill Clinton said the same thing. Democracies don't fight each other. So if we can build a world filled with democracies, it'll be a more peaceful place. So this liberal hegemony was designed to be a place where the United States ran the world, but tried to run it along liberal principles. And on the seventh day, we rested after we saw that it was good. I am most interested in the democracy promotion part of that equation. And so most of the rest of the talk will not talk about, trade or international institutions. It'll be about the democracy part. Except I will say that there's one thing that I don't think it's in the Constitution. But part of the job description of most US presidents, informally, is leader of the free world. And there's something cool about being leader of the free world. Because if you're leader of the free world, it doesn't mean just that you run the world because you're powerful. It means you run the world because people like you, and that you're fighting for something that we all believe in. So this idea of combining the US power with liberal purpose has been a central strategy presidents have used to try to legitimate US power and purpose to domestic and international audiences. Sometimes it works better than others, but that's always part of the goal. How can I be leader of the free world, which means not just that I get to tell everyone what to do because I'm powerful, but because people like me and they like the things that I'm trying to promote. And then Trump becomes president. I'd like to focus a little bit more here on the second term that we're in the midst of. One of the first things Trump did was he basically shut down the US Agency for International Development. AID provided public health programs for people all over the world, development assistance, emergency humanitarian aid, and also democracy promotion assistance. And basically, Trump came in, he said, we're not doing that foreign aid thing anymore. And he didn't settle for announcing that he was going to discontinue the program. He stopped all the money. And they're still fighting about that in the courts. If Congress votes it in, and the president even if it's the last president, signs it into law, you're really not supposed to say, I'm not going to spend the money. But he said, I'm not going to spend the money, and I'm going to fire all the people doing the work. And it's not just the people who worked as government employees of USAID. It's also a whole range of private contractors and non-governmental organizations that were contracted by AID to do that work. So one of my favorite recipients of this was, I think it's the largest NGO, Catholic Relief Services. Was one of the either the largest or one of the largest nonprofit organizations that was contracting for USAID, and we don't trust those Catholics, especially if they're working for Catholic bishops, because Catholic Relief Services is the sort of international development arm of the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the United States. So, shut that down. Who needs the Voice of America? Which was designed initially to make sure that people in the captive nations, of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and other, allies of the Soviet Union would hear the truth provided by the U.S. government. Trump shut it down. Well, he didn't and a lot of these things, AID still exists in virtual world, and Marco Rubio is formally the administrator. I think Marco has like 9 jobs now. I'm not sure exactly how many things he's doing simultaneously, but he's in charge of an AID that has basically been shut down, but not formally. Same sort of thing happened for Voice of America. A variety of institutions have been created over the years that are, some of them are not formally a part of the U.S. government, but they're funded by the U.S. government. So the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created during the Reagan administration and funded programs to promote democracy all over the world. It was a bipartisan effort. There was an International Republican Institute and an International Democratic Institute, so each of the parties had a formal role, and they could choose, which actors in other states to support with assistance, and then they would work together to help countries run free and fair elections. And there was actually an organization in NED that was the Institute for Free Election Studies. The Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO both had formal roles in the National Endowment for Democracy. It's another organization that still exists, but they took away all the money. The Millennium Challenge Corporation was created by George W. Bush. And the idea of the MCC was, let's find poor countries that exercise good governance, that they're less corrupt than other poor countries, and they're more democratic, and they're more effective in delivering programs. Let's find countries that should be more likely to succeed, and let's sign multi-year compacts with those countries to fund a wide range of development activities. So NED was a Reagan administration initiative. MCC was a Bush administration initiative. MCC has had its budget slashed. It's still there, but it's had its budget cut significantly. There's a whole bunch of other agencies that have been substantially reduced. I'll talk a little bit about the State Department, and my friends from the State Department can correct me if I'm wrong. And feel free to throw something at me right now if I get this incorrect. The State Department budget has not been slashed to the same degree as the budgets of all these other organizations, but they have been reduced significantly. And the things that have been targeted, or some of the things that have been targeted, are the things most connected to the democracy promotion mission of the State Department. How many people were here for Evan Cooper's talk at our last talk? So one of the things that Evan Cooper talked about that is really important for understanding where the State Department is today is that it's caught in a really awkward space in the bureaucratic battles in Washington, D.C. Because you've got a $1 trillion Department of War. You've got and they have friends all over the country. I mean, my goodness, we even have a bunch of ROTC students here. Lots of campuses across the country have ROTC programs. So that's just one of hundreds of different ways. The most consequential ways are that every weapon system has components made in at least 30 different states, because it means that you have the members of Congress and the senators from those states that have a vested interest in sustaining those weapons programs. The State Department has no national constituency that comes close to matching the Department of War. Even the intelligence agencies have budgetary authority that's 3 times that of the State Department. One of the strategies the State Department has used over the last, actually since the 70s and 80s, is how do we make ourselves indispensable for whoever's president of the United States at this particular time. And one strategy that the State Department has used is to make democracy promotion one of their central missions. And a whole series of agencies or units within the State Department were created over the years to promote democracy and human rights. And it became a part of one of many things that ambassadors had to do, is to try and figure out how to ensure that if they're attached to a country that is a democracy, that they can support a continuation of that democratic regime. And if they're not attached to an embassy in a democratically governed state, how can they support people who are trying to build democracy in that context? And so the State Department still is a large organization, still has a large budget, but they've shut down all the things related to that democracy promotion mission. Some of that activity is still going on, but it has to be more sort of quiet, because you can't go up against folks who have become friends of the administration. I'll just mention tariffs briefly. Switzerland has now a 39% tariff rate relative to the United States. By some measures, the oldest continuous democracy in the world. Depends on how you count that democracy thing, because in the 1700s it meant something slightly different than it means today. And women didn't have the right to vote in Switzerland until I was already on the planet when women finally got to vote in Switzerland. And I'm old, but I'm not that old. So there seems to be no connection between regime type and who gets the tariffs. Tomorrow Brazil may have more than a 50% tariff because the Supreme Court has just sentenced the former president of Brazil to 27 years in jail for launching a military coup, or trying to launch, unsuccessfully, a coup to return him to office after he lost the last presidential election. And Trump already punished Brazil with a 50% tariff rate because they put him on trial. We'll see how that goes. And of course, in the olden days, the United States would usually hold authoritarian leaders at arm's length and still be friendly with those with whom we had shared interests, but not, uproariously happy all the time. But to be very, harsh often in criticism of authoritarian regimes that we didn't need as much. And so Joe Biden said, I'm not even going to talk to Putin. And Donald Trump met him in Alaska. Donald Trump wishes Bolsonaro was president of Brazil again, and he's going to punish the democratically elected president of Brazil for allowing him to be put in prison for 27 years. It'll probably be house arrest, but still. The house gets kind of cold and old and tight if you have to be there for 27 years. I don't want to talk about this because we could end up talking about this for the rest of the session, and I want to talk about other things, but yeah, democracy is kind of challenging at home these days. But I want to focus more on the challenges of democracy abroad and examine what it meant that the United States for decades said, building democracy around the world is part of how we show everyone in the world that we're special and you should follow us. And we have a president who said, that's nonsense. So I expect that that will probably have a negative impact on democracy around the world. But, and this is a more important point, maybe not more important, but an important point to consider. The reduction in the number of democracies around the world didn't start with Donald Trump. The high point in the number of democracies around the world was 2007, according to Freedom House. Different measures of democracy, put it at a slightly different time, but we've been headed on a downward trend from some time in the aughts, depending on exactly how you want to count these things. And I'll just give you a couple of stats, and this is, Freedom House is just one of many organizations that tries to measure the quality of political regimes around the world. And they examine political rights, which ask whether leaders are selected in free and fair elections with universal suffrage and opportunities for effective contestation amongst multiple political parties. They also judge countries based on civil liberties, focusing on freedom of expression and belief, associational rights, and the rule of law. And they combine these into an index, and they say, if you are free, it means you score high on the political rights and the civil liberties. If you are partly free, you're either sort of middling on both of those, or maybe you're better on one and less on the other. If you're not free, you suck on all dimensions. In 1988, the year before the fall of the Berlin Wall, 36% of the world's 165 countries were coded as being free, 27% were coded as being partly free, and a plurality of regimes, 38%, were coded as not free. In 2007, 47% of the 193 countries in the world at that time were coded as free, 31% were coded as partly free, 22% were coded as not free. By 2024, 42% were coded as free, 29% as partly free, and 29% considered not free. And a number of countries with very large populations moved from the free to partly free category. So like, if you're just counting countries, you've got a lot of really tiny countries with small populations. But if India and Indonesia go from free to partly free, then you've got a couple of billion people who now live in countries that Freedom House codes as not being completely free. There's another data set that has become sort of the new scholarly data set to go to. It's called VDEM, or Variety of Democracy. And increasingly in my field, we have to depend on the Scandinavians to give us the best data about everything. So they have the best data on conflicts, international and civil conflicts. They have the best data on regime type. They just sit up there, I guess it's cold, and they just collect data all winter long. And then they make it available to the world. VDEM says that 2024 was the first year in decades when there were more autocratic regimes in the international system than democracies. It was close. There were 91 autocracies and 88 democracies. But they also, because they also weight this based on population, they say nearly 3/4 of the people in the world live in autocracies now. And they measure their data at the end of the calendar year. Joe Biden was still president at the end of 2024. So this happened before Donald Trump's second term. It happened before all of the things Donald Trump has done to de-emphasize the democracy promotion mission that the United States has often pursued. So the question that I ask, and I probably should have gotten this more than a half hour in, but the question I ask is, what is the relationship between the rise and fall of American power and the rise and fall of waves of democracy and autocracy in the international system? Because the United States isn't as powerful relative to the world as it was, 30-some years ago. Can we connect the changes in America's position relative to others in the international system to changes in the number and quality of democracies around the world? So back 100 years ago when I was in graduate school in the 1980s, most scholars of democracy would say it doesn't make any difference at all because democracy emerges or doesn't emerge because of things going on inside the countries. It has very little to do with what is happening in the international system. And so we know rich countries are more likely to sustain democracy. Ethnically homogeneous countries are more likely to sustain democracy. Regimes that have steady economic growth are more likely to sustain democracy. Regimes that have been democracies for a while are more likely to sustain democracy. And also, regimes that have vibrant civil societies with lots of non-governmental organizations, lots of civil society groups, a vigorous, independent press, are more likely to sustain democracy. And on top of all that, for some regimes, they cut deals. When they start up the democracy, they say, okay, we'll agree to compete in elections and not kill each other. We'll cut deals, we won't cut heads. And I won't attack the things that you value the most. You won't attack the things, if you win, you won't attack the things I value the most. So sometimes democracies just emerge because of political pacts. And if those political pacts are sustained, those democracies will be sustained. There are some countries that get coded as democracies where the people who fought a civil war decided, okay, you get to be president for this 5 years, and then we get to be president for the next 5 years, and then you get to be the president for the next 5 years. Colombia did that. Stable democracy, where the votes didn't matter that much, which is awkward for the whole concept of democracy. But they maintained peaceful coexistence by sharing power. So maybe it doesn't matter because it's stuff going on inside the countries that matters the most. But another part of this is that we need to look at the various mechanisms that the United States uses to try and promote democracy, or has in the past tried to promote democracy, and also at how the changing balance of power has changed, what is possible. And for that matter, look at potential contradictions in the liberal world order that the United States tried to build and how that could undermine democracy in certain contexts. So that Bush national security document was designed in part to make a case for why it made sense to go to war against Iraq. How's Iraqi democracy doing this week? Actually, it's not terrible. Yeah, forgive me, I'm going to use technical social scientific jargon. I'll try to use as little of that as possible, but you might think of Iraqi democracy as being in the category of half-assed democracies. And these data sets code some of them as electoral democracies but not full liberal democracies, or as electoral autocracies, where they have elections on a regular basis, but the dictatorial leader manipulates those electoral processes such that somehow they always win. But the fact that they have the elections is meaningful. And then some of them are just, Iraq still has elections on a regular basis, and they're not fully cooked because there's no political party in Iraq that has enough, popularity and power to dominate the political system, and so they sort of make it up on a regular basis. It's not a very effective democracy, but it could be worse. It could be Afghan democracy. And after 20 years of trying to build democracy in Afghanistan, the Taliban reemerged and took power again. The Taliban don't particularly believe in liberal democracy. So, one lesson a lot of people took from those experiences was if you try to impose democracy through military force, it's likely not to be successful. And it's not likely to be successful in part because the targets of military intervention are often the countries least likely to have the domestic conditions that would support democracy. Afghanistan was never going to be an easy case for promoting democracy. One of the poorest countries on the planet. Very few people have gone to the academy and therefore learned to embrace liberal values, or La Cueva, or UNM, or wherever. So Afghanistan was always going to be a tough job. And that's part of the problem. But another part of the problem is that there are always contradictions built into this, potential contradictions built into this supporting and promoting military intervention as a tool for democracy promotion. And one of the central contradictions is you likely are not going to intervene in a country unless you have material interests you're trying to pursue. And in order for you to pursue those interests, you need a friendly government in place, one that will do what you want it to do. But if you have free and fair elections, and they actually are real elections, you build uncertainty into that context and the possibility that people you don't want to run the country win the elections. And indeed, that's precisely what happened in Iraq. Defense Department at that point, wanted Ahmed Shalabi, who I think was a convicted felon from Jordan, to be the new president. That was our guy. We're going to have elections, he's going to win, everything's going to be cool. CIA wanted Ayad Alawi. The Iraqi people didn't want either of those folks. And so we had the first free and fair elections in Iraqi history, and clerical parties connected most closely to Iran won the most seats. That says something about the seriousness of the commitment to try and run free and fair elections, but it also put the U.S. government in a bind. We don't want Iran to run Iraq. That's not the point of this whole intervention. And if you add to that, the additional problem that if you go in to try and say, all right, all the guys who ran this country before are enemies and get the hell out, it means you do things like abolish the army and fire everyone who worked for the Ba'ath Party. And so a lot of the guys in the army took their guns with them when they were cashiered. And we created the opportunities for insurgency by our strategy of build democracy by getting rid of the bad guys. If you ask a lot of people who served in Afghanistan, if you could go back in time and say, hey, Hamid Karzai, could you actually, cut a deal with the Taliban, let some of them into your government and encourage them to not try to fight back? A lot of those folks would say, yeah, if I could go back in time, I would encourage that. But the whole point was, Taliban are the bad guys. We want them gone, period. And that led to a 20-year civil war. And then when the United States decided to get out, the Taliban walked back into Kabul. So there are these potential contradictions in why you intervene in the first place and how that connects to democracy promotion. And there are a lot of reasons why Afghanistan and Iraq didn't work out particularly well. A lot of them have to do with the contradictions in US policy. There was a case early on that actually worked pretty well. Can anyone think of a case where a US military intervention led to sustained democracy, and you can't tell me Germany or Japan? Panama, yeah. So Panama was the first military intervention after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And since that intervention, Panama has sustained continuous democracy to this very day. And part of the reason for that is that Panama was a somewhat wealthier society than a lot of other targets of US intervention. It helps if you have an economy based on transportation and commerce, rather than an economy based on oppressing, agricultural workers, to the point where they want to launch a revolution against your government, which was happening in other parts of Central America. So they had a particular economy that was more conducive to democracy. But then another crucial part is that they sort of found a sweet spot between achieving the concrete material interests that got us involved in the first place and combining that with democracy. So they did shut down the Panamanian Defense Forces. But then they brought a lot of those folks back into a new Panamanian civilian police force after vetting them. So you didn't just send them home with their guns and say, we hate you, never come back. They said, you have a chance to be a part of the new order. It'll be a different kind of role than, being a part of the army that governs the country. And the civilian members of the military-backed party were able to reconstitute themselves and run in the next elections, and they actually won the presidency in the second go-around. And so, but it's looking at that case, it gives you a sense of how difficult it is to, get through that needle. For most countries that made the transition to democracy in the wake of the Cold War, there were other dynamics at play. And it's really emulation and incentives. There are some countries that are just like, hey, those were the winners. Those guys seem to be the most successful countries in the world. Maybe we should copy what they do. And for some countries, the transition to democracy was, we've been governed under an authoritarian regime for a long time. We never liked that very much. And this seems to work. Let's try this. And then if you combine that with incentives, you get a good understanding for why virtually every country in Eastern Europe became a democracy. Not all of them sustained it. Viktor Orban is doing his best to get in that sweet spot for half-assed democracy. But for most of the East Europeans, it was, we want to be a part of the West. But there were also profound material incentives for that. We want to be a part of the European Union because we think that's the path to prosperity, and we want to be a part of NATO because we don't trust Russia. Exactly. They could drop something on us again. And so very strong material incentives for the Poles and the Baltic states and the Czechs. So they want to copy us because they think this is the right way to be, but they also want to be a part of an alliance that will protect them. and they want to be a part of an economic organization that will bring prosperity. In other parts of the world, there wasn't quite as big a payoff as NATO plus EU. Doesn't get much better than that. But for a lot of other folks around the world, moving towards democracy was a way of encouraging other states to trade with them. It was a way of encouraging international financial institutions and development organizations to invest in their country. If you have something like the Millennium Challenge account, you have an incentive to put on a good face of good governance and democracy because there might be some money associated with that. And even before the MCC, there were a lot of folks who were trying to create those kind of incentives. If you want to have access to development assistance, if you want to have preferential trade agreements, join the democracy bandwagon. And a lot of folks joined the democracy bandwagon because they thought it would pay off. And then, what happened to the liberal international order? One thing that happened to the liberal international order is, and this is one of the unexpected and unanticipated consequences, China got into the World Trade Organization. And China became the factory of the world. It could sell its stuff to everybody on the planet because they were a part of this liberal international institution which said, if we trade with one another, we'll be peaceful towards one another. So your prosperity is good for world peace. And it's mutual prosperity because we get lots of cool stuff for, fewer dollars if we can buy it all from China. Integration of China into that international economic order created the opportunity for a dramatic increase in Chinese power. And by the teens, at the time when you have some backsliding around the world in democracy, one of the reasons you had that backsliding is China became so wealthy so quickly and so powerful that there were alternatives to sucking up to Uncle Sam and the International Monetary Fund. And if you go to China and borrow the money, China is not going to say, we didn't like your last elections. They didn't seem to be up to snuff. You put Bob in jail. That was really mean-spirited of you. We're not going to give you money as long as Bob's in jail. I'm sorry, I shouldn't probably have put you in jail. Forgive me for doing so.
Probably deserved.
Of course not. So with things like the Millennium Challenge Corporation and increasing conditionality for aid and trade relations, countries had to jump through more and more hoops in order to get those special economic relationships, and they got tired of that nonsense. Whereas if you go to the Chinese, they'll say, all we want to make sure is that you hire our contractors and, you pay back the loans. And if you don't pay back the loans, it's just like any loan. There's collateral. So if you don't pay back the loan on the port, maybe we get the port. But if they had to go to, somebody in DC to get the money for the port, it would take 10 years to get all the approvals and to do all the impact reports and to get to the point where your country is sufficiently democratic and uncorrupt for us to consider loaning you the money for a port that will take twice as long to build than if you just hire the Chinese contractors. So if you want the port and you want it soon and you want it without a lot of strings, you can go to China now. And so a lot of countries, a different sort of motivation to emulation is pretense. So a lot of countries put on a good show because that was expected of them if they wanted to get stuff from the United States and from other countries. And they didn't have to pretend anymore. They could just go to China, and China wouldn't, make them jump through that many hoops. And so the biggest problem of erosion of US power, and also one of the biggest problems, erosion of democracy around the world, is not, China's military power, it's China's economic power. And that was made possible by their membership in all the economic institutions that make up the liberal international economic order. Another of these problems with the unintended consequences of this liberal international order, what happens if China's making all the stuff now? Factories shut down all over the world. So I make my students read a book by Barbara Walter, How Civil Wars Start. And part of what she's trying to say is that, could we have a civil war in America? And she starts the whole book off with a story about one of the guys who was a part of the conspiracy to abduct the governor of Michigan and try her for her crimes and then execute her. The FBI found them before they got to that point. But the guy that she focused on was living in the basement of the Vac Shack on Division Avenue in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I know where the Vac Shack is. My dad was the principal of an elementary school that is the closest elementary school to the Vac Shack. To get from our house to that school, you have to drive by Steelcase International Headquarters, one of the biggest manufacturers of office furniture in the world. They shut down the factory at that site a long time ago and shipped I think most of the manufacturing went to Mexico rather than China, but it went out of Grand Rapids. And a lot of the people who went to my dad's elementary school, their children, they work for people who actually were a part of Steelcase workforce. And then if you go a little bit beyond the Vac Shack, you get to what used to be the Fisher Body plant for GM, automobile manufacturing. They shut that down too. All over the United States, all over the United Kingdom, all over Germany, all over Western Europe, factories shut down because you could buy stuff for less and the quality was just as good. You don't have to deal with that. And this is one of the things that spurs a lot of people to support populist political leaders. You feel like you've been left behind by this liberal international order because it left my job behind. And this helps to explain where Brexit came from. It helps to explain where Trump got a lot of his support and continues to get a lot of his support. People who feel like they've been screwed over by this system. And so you both have a decline in US power, in part because of the liberal international order, and a decline in the stability of democracies throughout Western Europe and the United States because of the unintended consequences of this liberal international order. So the things that the United States tried to do in order to make everyone love us as the leader of the free world help undermine the foundations of that system that the United States tried to create. And so all this stuff has been percolating for some time before we even got to Donald Trump's second term. And indeed, in his first term, he tried to do a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the people he hired said, no, that's not the way we do things, because we're the liberal hegemon. So, stop. He made sure he didn't hire any of those guys for his second term. So there is some truth to this idea that part of what happened in the first term was the people who had been working for a generation in the various bureaucracies of of the U.S. national security bureaucracies and the State Department had all been socialized to pursue this kind of liberal world order vision. And they didn't want to, chuck it all down the tubes. And the response in the second term is, well, don't hire any of those people to run any of these folks, any of these agencies, and get rid of a lot of the agencies. Just shut it all down. So is there a positive, possible future here for democracy in the world? I'll give you a couple of possibilities. First, there is still some truth to this idea that a lot of what determines democracy or dictatorship within countries is specific to individual countries and their characteristics. So even with 39% tariffs, I don't think Switzerland is going to lose its democratic institutions. And so the richest and most powerful liberal states are unlikely to fully backslide. They may have some slip-ups, like hire a guy with Boris Johnson hair, which got kind of awkward, but most of those states are going to be able to sustain their democratic regimes, even in a difficult international context, because of the character of their domestic political economy and domestic culture and domestic experiences. Also, if you go back to the Biden administration, for Biden, building a coalition to support Ukraine was like getting the band back together. It's like, let's get this liberal world order thing going and put it behind Ukraine, and together we'll give them enough military assistance that they can hold back the Russian forces. Trump says, yeah, that just gets you endless war till the end of time. He's not wrong about that, because the best that the US and the Europeans have been able to sustain so far is stalemate. And not a complete stalemate, but Russia gains a mile a day. And a mile a day in a decade or two, and they might take the whole country. But mostly what the aid has been able to accomplish is stalemate. But what's fascinating to watch is that as the US has pulled out of the Ukraine enterprise, the Europeans have finally said, well, maybe we actually need to do this ourselves. And now they're all talking about maybe increasing their defense spending to 5% of their gross domestic product. And they've worked out a deal where they can buy crap from the United States and give it to Ukraine, rather than the United States giving it to Ukraine directly. This is really expensive. But one of the things it suggests is that there are a lot of people in Europe who are saying, if the United States is no longer interested in being leader of the free world, maybe us liberal states can work closely together to try to sustain as much of this as we possibly can. And there are other folks in the world who are trying to do similar things in other regions. So even if the world system that the United States tried to support is crumbling, you might have regional efforts to bind liberal states together to build mini Pacific unions in a variety of places around the world. And so, for example, Latin America has been sort of second, a distant second, but second behind Europe in the institutionalization of efforts to have free trade amongst member states, to have shared democracy, and they agree to meet anytime somebody overthrows a democratic regime, and they'll do something about it. So it's not a lot of teeth, but you may have pockets of renewed effort to sustain liberal systems in collaboration in certain parts of the world. Maybe, in the future, they'll let the United States play in some of those pockets. I don't think that it's going to be possible for the United States to just step in, if Biden were to be elected again in 3.5 years and say, we're back. He could make the case that Trump was an aberration the first time, but he can't make the case that it was an aberration the second time, because especially even the second time, he clearly won a majority of the electorate in the United States. It wasn't an electoral college victory alone. It was a popular vote victory.
Not by much.
In America, one vote is enough.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't the victory that he claimed.
That's often the case. But if you're a European
Oh, yeah.
or a Canadian, you say, can we ever trust the United States again?
Absolutely.
And the answer is probably not, for a good long while. One other thing that I do want to suggest is that, the fastest growing category of regimes is this half-assed democracy. An electoral democracy with problems, or a competitive authoritarian regime or electoral autocracy where they have regular elections but they're mostly cooked. In the olden days, back in the Cold War, if you had autocratic regimes, they were often single-party revolutionary regimes like the Soviet Union or China or Communist Party single-party regimes in Eastern Europe or Cuba, or institutionalized military dictatorships. There are still a few single-party regimes, none more powerful than China today. There are still a few military regimes. Every third year, Thailand resurrects an institutionalized military regime where it's not just one general who's running the show, but the military as an institution steps in and runs the country for a while. Myanmar has sort of a military dictatorship in that old style, but they're few and far between. Most of the authoritarian regimes in the world today have regular elections where there are other parties competing. And sometimes you get unexpected results. So President Bolsonaro tried to sustain himself in office after he lost an election. And the Supreme Court in Brazil today sentenced him to 27 years for trying to launch a coup to stay in office. One of everyone's favorite, half-assed democracy, personalist, electoral autocracy was Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. And when he stepped down from office and Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong, became president, Bongbong didn't do what Duterte wanted him to do. In fact, I think he got sent away to some international criminal court. Continuing to have elections has unanticipated consequences, and sometimes the consequences are a regime that looked like it was never going to be democratic again takes a step back. And it's possible to cross from electoral autocracy to electoral democracy. Maybe not a strong and stable one, but as long as you still have an election, and those elections are free and fair, sometimes you get the result that the United States got in Iraq, where you tried to cook it for a particular outcome, you don't get that outcome. So some of these regimes, because they continue to hold elections, may have a restoration of democracy. And I went way more than 3 minutes past, and I apologize for keeping you so long, but thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.